Hi, folks. Today we're talking about cities in Europe. So, as we begin talking about European cities, we are ultimately going to be inherently making comparisons. It's a comparative discussion in a sense of what cities in Europe are like compared to what cities in the United States and North America are like. So, one of the ways that we can, at a basic level, make some comparisons is with many of the physical features of modern European cities and modern American or United States cities. And so we can begin with that with the question or discussion of landmarks. So when we think of cities, and particularly metropolitan regions, in the United States, we think of them in terms of landmarks. We often will think of these kinds of things. We'll think of subdivisions, we'll think of skyscrapers. So, with subdivisions, we're talking about suburban neighborhoods in particular, where you've got four or five or six different home styles that will rather repeat throughout the subdivision, throughout the neighborhood. So, and again, a lot of that comes out of our discussions of what McDonaldization is all about. The fact that we have this sort of prepackaged kind of approach to a lot of what we do in major sorts of land use kinds of endeavors. So, subdivisions, a lot of suburban neighborhoods kind of look the same. And so that's one of the ways to sort of spot a landmark is, do you see it fairly often, and does it have a similar look from time to time or place to place? And so that's a good example of how something is McDonaldized but also is a landmark feature of metropolitan areas in our country. Another good example historically of a landmark within our country, be it in the city or in the suburbs, are skyscrapers. And so we can find skyscrapers, of course, in our major cities. And so downtown Detroit has a number of them. For instance, the Renaissance Center, the Book Cadillac Tower, the Book Building. Those are examples of Detroit's skyscrapers. But you can also go out on the Lodge. You can also go out along 696, and you can find skyscrapers, if you will, right there on the Lodge in Southfield, or right as you get into Farmington Hills going off of 696. Or if you go to Troy and you see the top of Troy skyscraper right at 75 in Big Beaver. So when it again comes to U.S. cities, you'll find these kinds of landmarks that just are repeating all over the city, but also the metropolitan region that surrounds that major city. Increasingly, a landmark that we see much more common now in our country are warehouses. And if you think of Amazon and Walmart, and if you think of how much, particularly during the pandemic, that we are purchasing through apps and through some kind of e-commerce, some sort of gig economic activity, so much of that, of course, is heavily reliant on logistics and distribution networks. And so we have a number of warehouses that are propping up all over southeast Michigan so as to facilitate these kinds of transactions that are becoming much more common. So, conversely, that leads to another sort of waning set of landmarks that we often can look at here in the United States. And so, with that, we're talking about malls and shopping centers. Now, we still have malls, but we tend to have more strip shopping centers now. Those sort of strip malls, we have those much more, in a sense, regular and much more stable, if you will, in terms of their presence than with respect to actual regional and local malls. Because we're doing so many of our transactions online, and we're doing so many of our transactions now through e-retailers, malls are not around as much as they used to be. And so that's been one of the big discussions, is how much we're seeing malls close and how much we're seeing a lot of retailers go bankrupt, traditional retailers that are used to some sort of brick and mortar kind of presence. And so, again, malls still exist, but it tends to be the higher end malls, like your Somerset collections, for instance, as an example. Those tend to be the ones that stay around for a longer period of time. They are indeed still landmarks. Again, although we don't see them as much, the strip malls, the strip shopping centers that we see, those tend, if you will, to be much more of the stable kinds of landmarks we see in major metropolitan areas throughout the United States. Now, if we compare cities here to their European counterparts, be it London, Paris, for instance, be it Berlin, if we're talking about European cities like those, often landmarks include castles, palaces, marketplaces, and churches, particularly very overtly social kinds of arrangements where you're looking at institutions that ultimately bring people together and often that are based upon a normal foot traffic, because we're looking really at cities that are often hundreds if not thousands of years old that were based upon the prevailing mode of transportation at that time, which of course was shoe leather walking, right? Often you'll see throughout Western Europe and Western European cities is the presence of multi-use buildings that have significant land density. So you've got a lot of buildings that are sort of crowded in and closer together, and again, you don't have with that as many skyscrapers. Now, there are some exceptions, such as the Docklands area of London, where you've got some newer skyscraper forms, but again, these are the exceptions and not normative, again, because you're looking at cities, as in the case of London, that are over 1,000 years old. We're also looking at ages wherein you have a mixture of very old and very new structures often right next to each other. And again, it's really about what function do we need to accomplish within this particular geography, as opposed to, well, this building's too young or that building's too old or something like that. Also throughout European cities, which is different from the States in the vast majority of cases, is that the most prestigious locations in and around European metro areas are indeed the cores, the urban cores of that particular metro area, whereas the least prestigious land is located at the periphery. So we typically see the more prestigious functions and the more prestigious land use as well as wealth concentration. We tend to see that much more here in the States, in the suburban ring, and in areas that are metropolitan beyond the urban core. So again, that's another way of thinking about what sort of makes European cities tick versus cities here in the United States. All right. Also this week too, as you look at the slide presentation, you'll be able to see that I've put up some excerpts of photos from a trip I took many, many years ago to Europe, largely spending most of that time throughout London and England, as well as Scotland and France. And so you'll be able to make within that some connections to a lot of the physical differences between European cities versus here in the United States. Now, suburbanization does have a presence throughout Western Europe and Western European cities, but again, it's at a much more muted level because, again, there are much more regional planning norms in and around European cities. There's, again, the way that you preserve the integrity and ultimately the stature of the downtown location is that you have to do that through policy decisions and through policy and action. And so that's ultimately what happens. And so that regional planning preserves that core, if you will, the higher status of the core urban area in European cities. All right. A few more things, some more stuff to talk about. Just like here in the States, there are it's multifactorial in terms of what factors have impacted Western European cities. And so technology, particularly post-industrial technologies and the growth of services and information technology with that, policies that undergird and support, if you will, concentrated planning and centralized planning, regional planning, those being normal decisions, if you will, for Western European cities. And of course, the existence of the European Union, which, although is certainly on its waning end at this point, nevertheless has had a significant impact on the shaping and the ultimately processing, distribution, and cultivation of goods and services throughout European cities versus here in North America and the U.S. All right, some more stuff. Now, challenges. There are numbers of, or a number, I should say, of challenges, if you will, that we can consider when we're talking about the case of European cities. One of the bigger challenges that has been a multi-decades long challenge for European cities in particular is the challenge of immigration. How much immigration to welcome, how much immigration is going to be healthy and going to be helpful to European cities and their regional economies. And so you see a lot of tension around this, particularly in and around Paris and France, in terms of how much, as a secular nation, should we ultimately permit not only immigrants to come, but in terms of promoting their cultural aesthetic and values versus what we often, as perhaps French citizens, want in terms of a secular kind of modality. Economic restructuring is not limited to the United States. Rather, the same issues of deindustrialization as well as a post-industrial economy based on services and less on factories, that also ushered in significant social and economic change throughout Western Europe, throughout Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. And also within that, a great deal of what was revealed from that would include significant environmental abuses, especially in terms of the factory development that ultimately allowed for the extraction of significant natural resources. And again, that harkens back to the industrial aspects and the industrial period, stemming, of course, directly from the Industrial Revolution. We talked briefly before about global cities, cities like London as well as Paris, that are command and coordinating posts for increasingly dispersed social and economic activities that tend to have the, if you will, markets for the goods and services that are ultimately produced, because they have often significant, very large populations that can be marketed to. But again, they also have that concentration of what are known as producer services. So finance, insurance, real estate, marketing, advertising, public relations, research and development. Those are great examples of those producer services. And so again, producer services, that's a fancy way of saying services for those who make something or who make a product. And so larger, if you will, if you think, for instance, certainly of the auto industry here, say, for instance, in Michigan, again, they retain and do require a significant amount of producer service outlay, particularly in terms of research and development. And so, again, a lot of the globalization work and literature comes out of the work of Saskia Sassen, looking at, again, these major cities like London that coordinate geographically widely dispersed economic, social, and cultural activities. And so the workers, often those at the top of the so-called social and economic hierarchy, embedded in these global cities, they're the ones that are ultimately, throughout their work endeavors, are in those command and coordinating functions. And so that small but significant amount of high echelon, higher status workers do contribute to a sort of income polarization where you have a small yet significant group at the top that have very strong authority and power, abstract power and workplace authority, as well as significantly higher incomes than the rest of the population. But again, you have, kind of like in a pyramid shape, you have the vast majority of your residents within a region that have very little or no kind of power or authority, if you will, relative to those who are at the top. And so that gives you that polarization, particularly in terms of incomes and particularly in terms of wealth inequality. So there is that connection between the status of global cities and wealth inequality that they ultimately sort of unwittingly sustain with respect to how they function.